All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're cracking open a toolkit that honestly, every single professional needs: business ethics. We're not just going to read from a textbook here. We're going to see how some really old ideas from philosophy give us the actual tools we need to handle the tough calls that businesses, and let's be real, you are going to face pretty much every day.
You know, the ancient philosopher Socrates dropped this line on us: the unexamined life is not worth living. And you might think, okay, what's that got to do with business? Well, everything. An unexamined decision, an unexamined company policy, an entire unexamined corporate culture, that's a recipe for disaster. So yeah, today, we're going to do some serious examining.
So let's just jump right in with a huge question. Can a business succeed, really succeed, make tons of money without having any ethics? By cutting corners? Well, maybe, but here's the real kicker. Even if it can, should it? And that's the heart of it, right? That's the tension that makes this whole topic so tricky, but also so incredibly important.
So, Section 1, the ethical dilemma. Let's talk about your toolkit. Look, when you're staring down a really tough moral choice at work, where do you even begin? It can feel overwhelming. That's where these things called ethical frameworks come in. And I want you to think of them less like dusty old theories and more like actual practical tools you can put in your professional toolkit. They're designed to help you make smarter, more responsible calls.
So what is business ethics really? When you boil it all down, it's about figuring out what to do when your values are in conflict. When there's no easy right answer. And to help us navigate that, we're going to load up our toolkit with 3 really powerful frameworks from some of the biggest names in philosophy: Aristotle, Kant, and Mill.
Okay, let's get into it. Our first framework is all about the consequences. It's called utilitarianism, and it basically asks one very straightforward question: which choice is going to create the best possible results?
This idea was really championed by the philosopher John Stuart Mill. And here's a key term for you. It's a consequentialist view. All that means is that the morality of an action is judged only by its results, by its consequences. The goal? Super simple, in theory. Create the most happiness and the least suffering for the most people possible. The greatest good for the greatest number.
And you see this kind of thinking everywhere in business, right? A company might lay off 10% of its people to save the jobs of the other 90%. That is a pure utilitarian calculation. But, and this is a big but, it comes with some serious challenges. How can you possibly calculate all the consequences, good and bad? And what about the minority, the people who get sacrificed for the so-called greater good? You can see how this could become a pretty slippery slope.
All right, so what if the outcome isn't the only thing that matters? What if some actions are just wrong or right, no matter what happens next? That brings us to our next tool, which is all about rules and duties.
This brings us to deontology, and the big name here is Immanuel Kant. For someone like Kant, a deontologist, ethics isn't some math problem where you're trying to add up happiness points. Nope. It's about following universal moral laws, rules that we figure out through reason. Some things, like lying or exploiting people, are just plain wrong. Full stop. It doesn't matter if you think a good outcome might come from it.
And this is Kant's most famous idea, the categorical imperative. It's actually a really powerful test you can use for any action. Before you do something, you have to ask yourself, what if everybody did this? If the world would just break down into chaos, or if the idea contradicts itself, then that action is morally off the table. Think about it. If everyone lied all the time, the whole idea of truth would mean nothing. So for Kant, lying is always wrong.
And this gets us to the absolute heart of Kant's ethics. People have dignity. You can't just use them like a tool to get what you want, whether that's hitting a sales number or boosting profits for shareholders. From a Kantian perspective, your employees, your customers, your partners, they all have to be treated with respect, as ends in themselves, not just as a means to an end.
Okay, so we've looked at outcomes with Mill, we've looked at rules with Kant, but our third and final tool in the kit focuses on something completely different. It's not about the action or the outcome. It's about the character of the person who's making the decision.
This is virtue ethics, and it comes to us from Aristotle. See, he wasn't as obsessed with breaking down single decisions. He was more interested in the long game.
What are the habits, the traits, the values that make up a good person, a person who is flourishing? For Aristotle, if you work on becoming a good person, cultivating virtues like honesty, courage, justice, then when a tough situation comes up, you'll just naturally make the right choice.
And this is a huge shift in thinking. It takes ethics from being a sort of checklist of rules or a cost-benefit spreadsheet and turns it into a question of identity. It stops being about, what should I do right now? And becomes, who am I trying to become over the course of my life and career?
So how do these different tools actually work when the rubber hits the road? This is where it gets really fascinating, because they can point you in completely different directions, even when you're looking at the exact same problem. Let's use a classic business dilemma, a potential product recall.
Okay, so imagine you're the manager. The utilitarian approach, you're going to pull out a spreadsheet. You'll be calculating the cost of the recall versus the statistical chance of someone getting hurt. You're weighing the financial hit against the risk to your reputation and to your customers, trying to find the path that creates the greatest good for everyone involved. But the Kantian manager, they'd say, throw away the spreadsheet. The calculations don't matter. You have a duty not to harm your customers. That's a universal rule. So you recall the product. Why? Because it's the right thing to do, period. And this table here shows how these philosophies aren't just for the classroom. They actually show up in how real companies run. Mill's focus on outcomes? Well, that's what's behind all those corporate social responsibility and sustainability reports. Kant's obsession with rules? That's your official written code of conduct. And Aristotle's focus on character? That's all about the company's culture, the ethical vibe that's set by leaders and role models.
But here's a really critical point from some research by Black and Rosman. They found this massive gap, a huge disconnect. Basically, managers and business owners, they get it. They know ethics are important. That's kind of the informal Aristotle side of things. But that personal belief was almost never backed up with the formal Kantian-style rules and policies.
Yeah, just look at this number, 20.4%. That is the percentage of companies in their study that actually had a formal, written code of ethics. Let that sink in for a second. It shows this huge gap between saying you believe in ethics and actually building the systems you need to make sure they're followed, especially when a real crisis hits. Without those systems, a company's incredibly vulnerable.
So, what's the big takeaway from all this? The most important point? It's that these theories aren't just for analyzing some big, faceless corporation. They are a roadmap for your own professional life. They help you navigate the choices that are going to define your entire career.
And Aristotle's virtue ethics gives us this fantastic roadmap. It starts with your character, right? Your core virtues. Those values then guide your everyday decisions. And those decisions, when you repeat them over and over, they become habits. And ultimately, those habits are what forge your professional identity. Every single choice you make is another brick in the wall of the person you're becoming.
So let me ask you this, and really think about it. If you were in a situation where you had to walk away from a job because it just went against everything you believe in, which theory, which tool from our kit would you use to back up your decision? Would you lean on Kant's idea of a universal duty, or to be more about Aristotle's concept of personal integrity and character? See, these frameworks give you the language to explain and defend your choices.
Okay, so as you dive into your Module 3 work, keep this toolkit handy. You're going to get to use these ideas for real. You'll be comparing how a utilitarian and a Kantian would handle the same business problem. You'll explain how virtue ethics can actually shape how leaders are developed. And you'll get to sink your teeth into a real-world case study using all three frameworks. The concepts we've walked through today, they're your foundation for all that work, so make sure to reference both the article and the textbook.
Because in the end, this is the biggest takeaway of all. The ethical choices you make, the big ones and the small ones, they're not just simple actions, they are transformations. They're what shape your character, what define your reputation, and what ultimately build the professional that you're going to be for years to come, and that is the real challenge and the real opportunity of putting business ethics into practice.